You're listening to the Kansas State Department of Education's Insight podcast, where we explore the people, policies, and progress shaping education in Kansas. In this episode, From Slate to Screen, the Journey of Public Education, we take a step back in time to better understand how we got here. Education in Kansas has come a long way, from one-room schoolhouses with slate boards to the dynamic technology-driven classrooms of today. But to truly grasp the current landscape of Kansas public education, we must examine the policies, reforms, and pivotal moments that have shaped it. How have legislative shifts and societal changes influenced our schools? And what lessons can we take from history as we navigate the future of education? Join us as we uncover the journey of Kansas education, exploring the challenges, triumphs, and transformative policies that have paved the way for today's students and educators.
Welcome, everyone, to the inaugural KSDE Insight podcast. I'm Randy Watson, Commissioner of Education, and we're glad that you joined us on our first episode, where we're going to take a look about the history of education, both K-12 and higher ed across the country, but specifically in Kansas. And I have two distinguished guests here with me today. They're going to kick off this first podcast in our monthly series. Dr. Debbie Mercer, the Dean of the College of Education at Kansas State. Welcome, Dean Mercer.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And Mark Tallman with Kansas Association of School Boards, and not doing lobbying work anymore, but certainly doing a lot of research and articles around K-12 education. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you. I know you're struggling to find my title. I don't know what it is anymore either, but yes, after a long time working in the legislature, don't have to worry about that this time of year anymore, and delighted to be a part of this discussion.
Maybe emeritus or something, educator emeritus.
That has not been brought up yet that I'm aware of.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned to the audience, we're going to kind of take a little bit of a walk down memory lane, both from a national perspective and a state perspective, kind of give everyone up to date on the major things that took place in education. So we'll just kind of make this freewheeling, and obviously as we get going, we may want to question each other about, wasn't that a good time? And so what we're hearing at the national level right now is maybe a return to the states of the power of education. And so let's just start. The history going back to colonial times, really when we fought the Revolutionary War. What were some of the thoughts around what education should look like as we formulated the United States of America? How much was going to be at the federal level? How much at the state level? How much at the local level? And of course, we'll carry on for the next 250 years to kind of bring us up today. So I'm going to pose the question, and either one of you can jump in, again, from the perspective of K-12 or the perspective of higher ed. And if we want to jump across with each other, that'll be great too. So anyone want to kind of start with your thoughts on the origin?
Well, I think the dean outranks me, so I should probably yield.
Since we don't have a rank for you, we don't know the answer to that. But I'm happy to jump in. So I'll say first, education has been my entire life, and Kansas education has been my entire life. I'm a product of public schools in the state of Kansas, from kindergarten clear up through my doctoral program, and I've dedicated my professional life to education. So I think the ideals remain the same. We want to impact lives. We want to have a democratized society. We want to create the knowledge to solve real world problems. And I think that was at the forefront of the beginning of education, and I think those ideals hold true today as well.
Yeah, I think no doubt about that. I too am a product of K-12 public education, and firmly believe it's a great equalizer. I tell people all the time, my grandmother was the matriarch of our large extended family. My grandparents did not go to past 8th grade high school, and she called all the grandkids together with all of their kids, which would be my mother, and said, we think you ought to go to college. It is the ticket. These were Depression era people. We don't care what you do, but being a teacher is a noble cause, and you may want to think about doing that. And several of my generation that decided to take that up. So, Mark, where for you did that get started? Where did that notion come from in our country?
Well, I think, I don't want to I don't want to attempt to sound like a history professor or anything, but if you go back to the Enlightenment, Commissioner, so we have to remember that when America...
You realize I do have a degree from Kansas State University as a history
and I don't. I have a degree in English from Fort Hays State, so I'm making this up as I go. But I do think it's important to remember that, America was founded, the early colonists, a couple of things were important. They put a high premium on literacy, partly for religious reasons. You have to be able to read the Bible. And they put a high premium on citizens being able to participate in their democracy, in their government. And the idea was, you need at least some rudiments of reading and writing to understand that. And so even though far fewer people had a lot of years of education, it was I think a strong idea that education was important. Maybe the distinction was, as we know, when America was founded, the Constitution didn't provide a role for education. And at the time, the federal role was really seen as to be quite limited. And so the idea was what education happened tended to be first pretty local and then more state. But like everything, as societies become a little more complicated, a sense of responsibility kind of rose up. But I think that idea from the beginning was if America was going to work as a concept, both practically, morally, and any other way, people thought that education was important. And to do that, you had to make it accessible to really everyone. And although we didn't necessarily do that at the beginning, that idea, and that's part of what drove the common school movement, I guess, that idea that really going back to the colonial in the first many decades of the country, this movement to the idea that there ought to be free public education broadly available, because that was in the interests of everywhere from your small town all the way up through the country needed that.
Yeah, I think, again, if we go back to the early colonists, most schools were religious, private, and most Americans, or pre-Americans at the time, didn't have access. And so you're right, there was this growing movement that really were over decades to say, but if we're going to have this democracy, we're really going to do this differently. We have to have people that are literate and can fully participate in this democracy. And thus, by the time, even well before the Civil War, we were talking about free public education for everyone, which was a pretty unique concept. Yeah. There were a little bit going on in some of the European countries, but not for the most part. And we established that as kind of a foundation that would be done state by state during that time. And then it wasn't too long after that where the Kansas Constitution is formed, and we form as a state. And there were some safeguards from the early beginning that education was going to be really important.
Absolutely. Intellectually, vocationally, scientifically. So if we jump, and we will in the next hour, right, to the pathways, directly in alignment with that original document.
Yeah, it was. And, it's so interesting. I tell people, even if you go to like the ordinance of 1787 and you look at how as we were to move westward, we were going to lay out this new country, schools became a part of that. And so in Kansas, I think as much as any other state, you can visually see that. Go out, get on a road anywhere in rural Kansas. You're going to find a road every mile. It's laid out in a grid system, and there was going to be a schoolhouse on that section of land operated by the local people in that community who were going to hire a teacher, and that was going to be the one-room schoolhouse that dotted tens of thousands of those dotted Kansas from the time that we started Kansas well into the early 1900s. Mark, anything about those early days that strike you?
Well, I think one thing that we have been sort of now arguing about ever since then is sort of the relative. It's in our state constitution. State constitution, as the dean said, it's to have improvement. We're going to have a system of public education, but our state, somewhat uniquely, has a very specific role of local school boards, which is that local side. And so that tension of saying, well, it's really a local function. We want school boards to be responsible to our local communities. And yet at the same time, as a state, we have an interest. We haven't quite got that federal yet. But so that balance between saying, How do we respond to our local community and value that? But at the same time, what is our obligation to all students who are advancing the state? But that is something kind of unique, is that we specifically say public schools are to be maintained, developed, and operated by locally elected boards. Certainly not all constitutions have that. Pretty much all of them do mention education or have some structure, which is one reason that there's Kansas isn't unique. Some people know to having lawsuits and that sort of thing over, are you fulfilling your constitutional obligations around education? That's been something Kansas has talked about for probably since the beginning.
Yeah, and not too long then after Kansas adopts its constitution and comes into the Union, the first state board of education comes into play, and there's a direct tie right off the bat between the universities of Kansas and the state board of education, because the universities of our presidents of our universities actually were set up to oversee K-12 education.
Absolutely. So 1863, a big year in the state of Kansas, right? So we started the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia. We started the university in Lawrence, KU, and the Ag College in Manhattan, K-State. Fort Hays, Pittsburgh came later, but 1863, big year to establish those. And along with that, the Board of Regents that helped provide oversight in a very global type of way in the state. So they govern the 6 state universities. They provide supervision and some oversight to the community colleges, the technical schools, and Washburn. They oversee business operations. They hire those very people that you were just talking about, those chancellors, presidents, the CEO of each one of those institutions. So intricately woven from the very beginning.
Yeah, from the very beginning. And over the years, we'll talk about there's been a joining, a separation, and a little bit different alignment. But if you look, even from an early stage of our statehood, there was a direct tie to the Constitution of Kansas and to higher education and to K-12 education. But throughout those early periods, at least from the public education side, the university presidents were giving great oversight. But there was a state superintendent for many, many years. Mr. Tallman, can you talk about that and what the function of a state superintendent was? Because we don't have that today.
We don't. We last had one in around 1966, 67. I don't remember that quite, although I guess I was alive at the time. But for that initial constitution had an elected superintendent of public education. And conversely, we also had, or I guess at the same time, we had elected county superintendents of education, because we had far more local school units. We didn't have the several hundred school districts we have now. In fact, at times there were like thousands, because every little community and maybe every little school had its own board. To practically manage that, you kind of needed someone at the county level and then an elected official. That's nothing about Kansas. We tend to like electing officials, at least we used to. So you had kind of one person responsible for the K-12 system at the state level, overseeing local folks, and down beneath that, the local school board. That changed in 1966 when the legislature in its wisdom and the voters in their wisdom got rid of that elected superintendent, created an elected state board of education to hire a commissioner. So, Commissioner, you don't have to run for election, but your state board does, is where that accountability goes back to. And then the somewhat parallel idea was this Board of Regents, which we had, was put into the Constitution, but appointed by the governor. So again, this kind of dichotomy, you have an elected state board of education and appointed Board of Regents for higher education. Still the idea the two had to work together. And that's something I've just observed, is we have all these things that sort of are intentional a little bit, checks and balances to a point, but at the same time you have to keep figuring out how do those relationships work.
Yeah, exactly. Again, when we think about the formation of our country, it took a while for a lot of things to kind of come together, and we talked about the common school and the thought about free public education. Same thing with Kansas. So we go back to 1860. It's going to take us a while to figure out what's the structure of that going to look like. By the early 1900s, though, we're fully entrenched. We've got a university system going. We have tens of thousands of one-room schoolhouses on these every section of land, governed independently, with some oversight, loose oversight, at the state level. And I have to give a little bit of a story, because I live, as you know, in McPherson County. And there's an annual celebration that we have called All Schools Day. It takes place in May every year. It's a week-long celebration, but it culminates on a Friday and Saturday. And the history of that dates back to the early 1900s, when the county superintendent, whose job was to get on horseback and go to every one of the one-room schoolhouses in McPherson County, many of them, and bestow 8th grade diplomas. And he said, this is a lot of work. How about if we invite them to the big city of McPherson? We'll have a parade, and at the end of the parade route, I'll stand there and give everyone their 8th grade diplomas. And thus, over a 100-year celebration was born that still is around today, about honoring kids and their work. But 8th grade is where most people during those 1900s in Kansas, in a one-room schoolhouse, were going to end their formal education. Can we just talk a little bit about who would go to high school, who would go to college, in the period of the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s? Really, maybe we could argue up until about World War II. Why did we stop in 8th grade? What was going on? Why didn't everyone go on to high school? Why didn't everyone go on to Emporia State or Kansas State? What were some of the things going on?
Well, they needed to go back home and work on the farm. We were an ag economy, right? So my grandmother was one of those teachers that through 8th grade, a little bit of education post that, and then taught in one of those one-room schoolhouses under what is now Tuttle Creek Lake.
Is that right?
That is right. That is right. Very specific professions went on, right? And you kind of were tracked who went into those professions.
And two, if you go back to the 1920s, two specific vocational tracks, home economics and ag, were the two predominant. Woods, a little bit of that. But why did and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head the data that you and I have shared back and forth, but in the early 1900s, 1920, a small percent.
Well, so here's how I sort of place myself in this. My parents were born in the 1930s, okay? And at that time, because this is as far back as we have census data by states, at least that I found, about 25% of Kansans or Americans had a high school diploma, whatever was required.
I just want to pause on that.
Exactly.
Because I think, I always ask people, when were the good old days? And here's what I found. All right, this is my unscientific analysis. The good old days are whenever we went to school. Yeah. Because for most of us, that was a very good time in our lives. And so there's this, I think, perception that we did so much better back in those good old days. In the day. And again, say that again for us.
So in 1940, as far back as we go, only 25% of the population had a high school diploma, whatever that requirement was. When I started at KASB in the 1990s, and I learned that as a country, we didn't get over 50% high school graduates until the 1960s, I was astounded. Because I just assumed back in the Leave It to Beaver days, everyone had gone, had graduated, and everything was better. But it absolutely wasn't. With graduation right now, today, the level of education higher than ever. And maybe you're getting this point, at that same time, that same census data would tell us that in Kansas, one of the better educated states at the time, only 5% of the population had a 4-year degree or more. And today, people may or may not know, we're at about 35%. Every decade, every year, that's tended to go up. So in a sense, that constitutional requirement of improvement, if you're looking at least at levels of education, we've seen how that's played out. But I think people always, you're right, well, it used to be so much better. Our schools are failing, all these things we hear. Well, of course, it depends on your measures. But if you simply look at how many people are hitting those milestones, earning more credentials, it's clearly been expanding since the beginning. It's certainly been expanding over the last roughly 100 years.
Yeah, and I just think, sorry, Dean Mercer, we'll get to you.
No.
I just think, of my grandparents. I mentioned my grandmother. She was a hospital dietitian, Caulfield Memorial Hospital, a job that she was very proud of. She retired in 1985. To kind of put it in perspective when she ended her career. If we were to go apply for that job that she held, even in 85, but certainly today, it's a master's level in dietary management. She didn't have any degree. She started by putting food on trays and worked her way up, and that's what generally people did in that era. And so therefore, unless you were going to go to college, pursue something that you tend not to go to high school because you were needed to work. In fact, we can talk about why high schools looked a little bit like many colleges, set up the same courses, it's a little bit of the same requirements. But Dean Mercer, I think you were going to join in on some of that.
No, so Mark obviously put thoughts in both of our brains. And as we think about how schools are perceived, part of it is, are we talking about our school that we know? Or are we talking about all those other schools? So if you read the Kaplan, the Gallup poll comes out every year, and consistently, parents and community members say, teachers in my school are good, my school is good, but there's problems in all those other schools. So I think we have to balance that sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'd say the same. Well, yeah, Kansas has great education, and my school has great education, but we certainly wouldn't go to X.
And if you think about that, means somebody must be wrong. Right, and either our schools aren't really as great as we think, or everyone else's must be better than we think because their constituents think they're pretty good. And that's the difficulty. You tend to you look at things through your own experience, and that's almost inevitably a little bit limited.
And I think we'll talk about, and our own experience can be, if our kids went through school and had a good education,
right,
we think, well, that was really good. But what I'm reading today must be they're not as good as what my kid went through. Right. We'll talk about that. Yeah. I'll already a clarification for the listeners that may not know what Leave It to Beaver is. Because
dating myself again.
I understand that our younger generation, at least at our agency, would go, you have to explain those things because we don't remember Ward and June Cleaver. So just Nick at Night. You can Google it. We can watch that. You can watch that to your heart's content.
It was nostalgia when I was a kid in the 60s almost, but I think it just perpetuated this idea we've never, just as you say, there was a golden time some time ago when everything was better. Usually, if you feel kind of good about your life, where you were at that time, that's kind of the way it ought to be. And when that is maybe challenged or looks different, then you kind of have some questions about that.
And so life was pretty good. Most of us are going back to work on something related to agriculture. Maybe there's a little manufacturing that starts to take place in Kansas. Young ladies in particular were still homemakers of the home, and while some were going out, venture out, nursing, secretarial work or teaching were the primary occupations they were going into. But for most of us, again, that was kind of what happened. We went through World War I and came out of that, and of course, Great Depression hits pretty quickly after that. And as, again, my grandparents said oftentimes to us, because they had no work and left Kansas for a brief period of time to go to California in search of work before they came back, was if someone offers you a job, you work really hard. You show up early, you leave late, and while you may take a different job later on, they don't have to give you a job. And I think that hit home with us, really hard. But then young men went off to war for World War II, and a great war effort here at home where we rationed things and made things and helped our neighbors a great deal. And life really started to change when the GIs came home. Some of that was the GI Bill. And so I don't know if either one we want to just talk about the change then of the expectations of that generation and a little bit of impetus with federal money for the GI Bill of what started to change rapidly after 1945.
Well, education, that's what we're talking about today, right? The GI Bill allowed so many returning soldiers to obtain an education that very well could not have otherwise. So it charted that path, but it also sent a message that the federal government thought education was important, and that's where they were putting dollars.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the other thing that was interesting is we did reach this point rather rapidly of kind of believing that 8th grade isn't enough. Maybe you're not going to college, but you at least want to complete high school, and that would open some doors to have that. And so those graduation rates really did begin to rise, not necessarily for all populations or everywhere. And so that became kind of the expectation. And, whether it's cause or effect or push or pull or whatever, that then I think ratcheted up more expectation. So if more people are finishing high school, almost by definition, a larger pool of them may decide they're interested in some kind of college. And jobs responded to that, just as you said. Why was it decided you need an advanced degree to be a dietitian? Probably all kinds of reasons, but the fact is society did that. And so many jobs, employers were looking for more. And so that began this push to get more people to go to college. So you want to be a little provocative maybe. One of the things I think that became a challenge for K-12 is, as you said, the model for high school in some way was to prepare that relatively small number of kids going on to college for college. So you started having credits and units, and you studied things by discipline because that's what you would do. As more and more kids that maybe weren't necessarily going to college or knew what they wanted to do, high schools had only that model for them. So that worked well for the kids that it worked well for. But I think we've struggled for a long time to recognize there are kids in high school where maybe a 4-year college isn't really what they want to do or what their aptitude is, but that's still kind of how we're designed. And so figuring out how to also offer meaningful alternative programs for kids who really aren't as interested in 4-year college can also have a path to a higher level of skills than they otherwise would, but maybe a different. I know that's something, Commissioner, you've been involved in, and I think we've seen over the last 10, 20 years real efforts to kind of make high school a little more tailored for a variety of students, knowing that more and more will need something after high school, not necessarily a 4-year college. In fact, if you look at our data, I think it says Kansas is not bad in terms of turning out people to fill those bachelor's and advanced degree jobs. It's really more the level above a high school diploma, but up to that level where we tend to hear more worker shortages and then also students that if they don't have anything, high school diploma or none at all, they're really, the opportunities for them are simply not what they were. One last statistic, if I remember it right, because I talked to my parents. So when I was leaving high school leaving high school in the 70s, about 1/3 of jobs required a high school diploma, 2/3 of jobs high school diploma or less. That's now switched. And so now over the 40 years of my adult life, roughly, we've turned that around so that, 2/3 require more than high school. That other third, almost all, at least require high school. When you think about how schools have had to respond between what they're expected to do for a third of the kids to how you double that or more and provide other meaningful educational experiences, that's a pretty big change that a lot of us my age and younger kind of went through that, maybe didn't see it, but it really has changed how schools have to try to operate.
Yeah, I think, again, go back to the 20s, especially after we get past World War II, maybe the biggest remnant of that was Latin. Yeah. Everyone at one point, when they went to high school, took Latin because, again, you need to learn that vocabulary as you think about a college degree. And you would be hard-pressed across the country, much less in Kansas. You might find a school or two that offers Latin as an elective, but certainly not every student is having to take Latin because as we grow and adapt and the economy changes, you think about we become the world's industrial might coming out of going into World War II. We scaled up for that and we came out of that. and we need a more educated populace to keep this up, the GI Bill, as we mentioned. And at 1940s, 1950s, going into the 1960s, the ticket was to go to college, or go to work. But the ticket was to go to college, and we just watched this phenomenon happen where the middle class just grew exponentially because of a great manufacturing base and a great higher education base that really took off. And even Dean Mercer, even in agriculture, which K-State was founded upon, we see that the requirements even coming out of World War II, where we're going to make the farms more automated, or if you would. I mean, technology was rapidly expanding even in that time.
Absolutely, mechanical, right? And so then engineering programs grew out of that, and ag mechanics, et cetera. But, we've talked about the knowledge base purpose of schools. We haven't overlaid the maturity base, the social emotional, are kids ready to do that next step, regardless of what that is. And I think that was an issue as you were discussing those statistics, Mark. It's an issue for us today. Sometimes they need another 4 years to be ready to go.
And I've always thought that one of the things that was great about Kansas State for me in the day, and we're the same generation, was no social media, so there's a little record of anything that I would have done there, and you'd have to go search really, really hard. But it was an opportunity to grow up.
Absolutely.
And people that went right into the workforce never had that. Right. They really had to grow up in a hurry. You'd show up at 8 o'clock or 40-hour shift. I got to ease into that and figure out, okay, I need to grow up a little bit. I need to take some responsibility. And so it was along with the academics that I was learning that those things came together, and you got to cheer on a basketball or football team and all the great things about college. And I know that we're going to think today about the technology and the shifting nature and the speed of which, but I have to tell the story because I think it's evident the difference between my great-grandmother and my grandmother's generation. I was sitting in the home of my great-grandmother, and with my grandmother and my mother, and they were telling the story of the first date that my grandparents had. My grandfather shows up in a Model A to pick up his date, and my great-grandmother was having nothing to do with this new fancy thing. Said, we have some horses that are fully fed and watered, and please take them into town. And no, Mildred, it's going to be great. This is great. And of course, what happens? The car breaks down. and the story, but the pace. My great grandmother didn't know when she was growing up. Radio, TV, motion pictures, an automobile. All of those were my grandparents' era. And we think today, right, in this podcast or social media, how rapidly now things are turning over for kids, and then what do we teach, and are we still going to teach Latin? So, go back to the basics, or what are we going to do with that? And so schools, we have more kids now going to high school, dramatically more kids going to high school. Slowly, more kids going on to college, but certainly high school. And then in Topeka, Kansas, a court case springs out and says, well, something's wrong in the way we're distributing young people. Who wants to jump in? Because not too far from where we're recording this podcast is a monument to that, where the school where that court case sprung out of, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, which did some remarkable things that we still have in this country.
Absolutely. So separate but equal is not okay, right?
Which
right.
was an 1890s Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson that had stood the test for over 50 years. Right. was overturned.
It was overturned, unanimously overturned, and I think sometimes we forget that piece, and that was critical. And who was a major player in that? Well, ended up being a Supreme Court justice. So laid the groundwork, and his Thurgood Marshall's complete career was built around that early case.
And again, it kind of harkens back to the early 1800s when we're talking about free public education for all. Supreme Court said we're not there yet. We're segregated, and and separate is inherently unequal. And that was revolutionary, and of course caused a great amount of turmoil in the late 50s and early 60s as we try to desegregate these schools.
That's right. We have vestiges of that still. And of course, my understanding of history is one reason that Topeka, Kansas was kind of picked one of the test cases is because it wasn't in the Deep South, and it was a place where maybe desegregation could proceed a little bit. At the beginning when I sort of said public education for all, I tried to have a verbal asterisk about that, pointing, well, it really wasn't always true. And I think what you saw starting with Brown and then moving into the 60s and 70s, very much the part of education began then talking about other groups that hadn't been served as well or at all. So you certainly have race as an issue with desegregation. The 60s, of course, became, more broadly speaking, a time of civil rights and looking at other groups that have not been served as well. And then, of course, in the early 70s, early to mid-70s, special education law really for the first time began to mandate serving kids with disabilities. So another part of that transformation was moving from a school system that served a lot of kids well, but many kids not at all, to saying we're really going to try to reach everyone. And that, too, we can't underestimate how that changed the schooling of my grandparents' time, even what I can remember, in the 60s and 70s, to the kind of things that public education is expected to do now. One of the reasons why, by most measures, public education hires more people, costs more. Some people will point out, well, you're spending a lot more, but we are also doing a lot more because we've added programs that didn't exist before to serve kids who wouldn't have been there before and educate them longer. So I think that both nationally and in Kansas, that period of time in the 50s, 60s, 70s in particular was really about sort of reaching kids that hadn't been served or included before in a different way. And that then led also to legal action over funding systems and that sort of things, because again, we had a system mostly funded at the local level, and part of it, and as I think one of our Kansas court decisions said, when the whole state at the time of statehood was basically a bunch of farms, and that's what it was, a property tax system would work pretty well, it was fairly equalized. As that changed and differences in wealth became really significant across the state, we started to realize that if you're going to try to educate everyone to some equitable level or goal, you couldn't continue to just rely on local tax base or local responsibilities. All these things have led to a more kind of complicated and expensive system, which can really frustrate people sometimes. And wonder, why does it have to look this way? But a lot of these grew up as we tried to broaden who public education tried to serve.
Absolutely. Did either of you have any impact in your early schooling of Brown? Because I certainly did growing up in Coffeyville, because we were segregated basically just by geographic part of our city. So there was Cleveland Elementary, which was all African American, simply because there were no whites living in that part of the town. But we didn't actually come together until 7th grade. So while my school had a few Hispanic, a few students of minorities, I lived a little bit of that experience until eventually, under desegregation orders well into the 1980s, Coffeyville, was forced to do some things. But I didn't know if either one of you had any effect or saw any effect of Brown growing up.
Small rural school, even though I wasn't too far from Topeka. So no, there was one option.
Yeah.
Kind of the opposite. I don't believe I met in the flesh a black person until I was in high school, and unlike you all public education folks, I kind of alternated between Catholic schools and public schools in Hays, Kansas, where I grew up. I went to Thomas More Prep in Hays. They had a boarding program, and we had some African American students, not from Hays. Other than that, any other minority populations were extremely small unless they were affiliated with the college was the main thing. So we were an example of someone who all that going on really didn't seem to affect us. Now, of course, if you go back to Hays, it's a more diverse community than it would have been, as most places are. But no, at the time, that it was like so many parts of Kansas. Desegregation wasn't an issue because there was not much population to segregate. It is. I just want to make one point. Someone I worked with for a long time, Frank Henderson, was a school board member north of Topeka here in the Seaman School District many years, went on to be president of the National School Board Association. But he talked about growing up as a young African-American man way out in western Kansas, still very much a minority, but families that had moved after the Civil War to try to homestead, try to farm. So there were pockets, but he'd talk about how a town might have a small population because some people had settled there, but that would be a very isolated part. And many other communities, there were no one who fit those categories. He also he talked about growing up that he said, I think other black people we were pretty well accepted because they knew us, but boy, when those Hispanics moved in, that was a problem. Yeah. And it just shows it is when you encounter the unknown or what you're not familiar with, that it becomes more of a challenge. And he talked about that being his experience.
Yeah, one of the great joys of my career have been as commissioner to serve, with the state board, and one of those members, Carolyn Campbell. And Carolyn went to a segregated school in Topeka, Kansas, and was friends with the Brown family of Brown versus Board of Education. And I often thought she brings such a unique perspective. And if you've ever heard Carolyn talk, she will talk about how proud we were of our African American schools, and the teachers all had master's degrees. And part of what happened in desegregation was that many of them lost their jobs because they were not allowed still to go teach in some of the desegregated schools, and so they lost that job. So there's lots of stories, that we can right here in Kansas where that came about. But I think for our listeners, it's clear to see that, and I say this a lot, I think as just America in general, it's this interesting thing of democracy where we're never perfect, but we aspire to be. And so we never get it right. In some cases we get it horribly wrong, but there's always this aspiration that we're going to do better. So we start with this concept that in the early 1800s, well before the Civil War, that free public education so we can have a literate population, and then that just starts to expand. Maybe high school. Maybe there's certain populations that are not being educated. And then by the mid-1960s, President Johnson says, I'm looking at this, and what we still haven't solved is poverty, deep poverty in Appalachia. And I'm going to go after this. I'm going to declare a war on poverty. And some of the things now we still see in 2025 started in those 1960s. Of course, President Johnson, a great advocate of civil rights. Would we like to talk a little bit about school lunch, school breakfast, title programs, and the aspirations of trying to solve the issue of poverty and making sure that young people did not have to grow up in poverty?
So immediately what comes to my mind, Commissioner Watson, is school breakfast that was a donut with lots of frosting and peanuts on top, and it smelled awful. And I remember having to go down to the lunchroom, and that's what would be served to us as an elementary student. So that memory of smell aside, it put in front of America as a society that we have children who are hungry. And it was maybe the first time that we really tried to address that systemically. And there was the school system ready to step up and do whatever they could. Now, there was funding that flowed, but it was the school system that was helping to solve that problem. And we know if children aren't eating, they are not. They're not learning.
Right, and I think that goes back. One of President Johnson's finding was we have these students that are in deep poverty, and they're hungry, and they're coming to school without food, and maybe we should feed them.
Yeah. Well, I think that, again, this theme of we're trying to educate everyone, but we're not reaching everyone. Some of the reasons why is that inequity maybe across districts, across states, and so the idea behind the federal role, and this was the time when, don't forget, we're trying to beat the Russians to the moon. We are accepting national goals and things like that. And so some of this idea is, well, what the federal government can do is not fund the bulk of education. It still doesn't. But it can say, well, we can play a role in feeding kids. We can play a role in promoting special education, helping kids with disabilities. The Title I programs, which I'm sure many people hear Title I and wonder why do we call them title programs? Well, it is a title of that law. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, part of the Great Society, was to say, okay, how do we get some additional dollars, not for the main part of the education program, but to provide some additional resources for these students that are being left behind. And so that really began that federal role that we are still arguing about today over what it should be.
And I think that's really important because we are arguing about the federal role, and Johnson really expands that role, because before that it was really a due process or a fairness of who had access to schools, Brown v. Board. He said there ought to be a federal role, though, in leveling the field around poverty, and took that very seriously. And around that same time, we have major event going on in Kansas, where if you go read newspaper accounts at that time, it was, we've got to raise our intellectual level beyond the one-room schoolhouse. We have too many of this and too costly. So walk us through what some of our ancestors would never want to remember, which were some either great times, if we look back on it, or some really hard times in the 1960s around the one-room schoolhouse, and we ought to bring the kids to town.
Yeah. Consolidation.
Well,
an awful word, Commissioner.
I know, horrible.
And as someone who spent many years working for the Kansas Association of School Boards, that issue of, well, what is local? We went through a period of time when we went through local being, as you said, thousands of local boards or districts, if you will, to consolidation, or in Kansas what we called unification, where everyone would be in one district that would offer a unified program at the time, first grade, now kindergarten through 12. What's interesting is now in the legislature and other places, we tend to hear consolidation as a way of getting efficient, right? We can save money. At the time, it was really more about, as you said, raising standards. How do we make sure that every student has access to a high-level, high-quality educational experience, particularly at the high school level? And so that drove that.
And the pushback, if you go to 2025, is maybe we got that in the one-room schoolhouse and we lost it when we came to town. I'm not saying right. I mean, I think that's at least a discussion that we're having.
That's exactly right, because some people would argue that when you kind of that model of efficiency, that bigger is always better, I don't know, does it create sometimes overwhelming bureaucracies, become harder to change? That's certainly a concern. And you're right, what I'm sure at the time was a conservative money-saving position of let's consolidate. Now what we hear championed is let's have more choice, let's have more flexibilities, let's have homeschools and charter schools and all these things. So you can really have, I guess the theory is, how well it works is debatable, you're bringing that governance closer to the individual student than maybe it was. So, yeah, I think it's true. A lot of these issues never end. They just kind of come back in different ways, because nothing that you do is without consequence. I think about that story you said, Carolyn Campbell, and how for all the benefits of desegregation, there was also things lost. And almost invariably, when you make a change, you just have to accept the fact that there will be some unintended, probably unwelcome consequences. Maybe how do you deal with that, or how do you think those through?
Yeah, and again, you think about the consolidation. We went from several thousand school districts, again, one-room schoolhouses, kindergarten, or usually grades 1 through 8 during that time. A few had kindergarten, to just over 300. You fast forward to 2025, and we're sitting at 284. So, I mean, we basically set up that system 60 years ago that we're in now. And of course, some legislators lost their positions in the Kansas House and Senate because there are a lot of people upset. And I can remember clearly in 1981, so now fast forward from the 60s in 1981, and I'm coaching basketball in Tuscany, Kansas, and after a fairly difficult ball game with our arch rival Bennington, when a parent said, "You never liked those Delphus kids, and you won't play them," and I went, "What?" And she was referring back to consolidation. When I have a little time, and as you both know, I travel throughout Kansas to all of our schools, and if I have a little bit of time, I may take off the beaten path and go through Culver, or go through Delphus, or go through Liberty. I'm just picking things. Yeah. And almost in every one of those communities, what I can drive by is a school that closed in 1965, 66, 67. Still there, not being used, but still there today. So vitally important, and we still see the remnants of the consolidation and the tensions that brought when communities that did not really like each other had to come together.
Absolutely. So where's Waldo, right?
Yes.
Where's Waldo, Kansas? Itty bitty. School was closed down. Did a research study there. Talked to an older woman who said, "Oh, I'm a newcomer. I've only been here 42 years," and that's how she saw herself, right? But you lose your school, that loses so much for the town as a whole.
You lose your school, you lose the community, is what some people say. Well, that's always true, but it's certainly a part of it. And I think that's why even today, as we have shrinking populations overall, and certainly in some of our smaller districts, not all, but many, are really continuing to struggle to have kids, and yet they desperately want to hold on because that school it's not just the educational center of the community, it is the community, it is the social, it is all those things, economic, arts, everything like that goes back, and they want to hang on to that, even when it may be a challenge to maybe offer everything those kids might want or need. But what's that trade-off?
Well, and let's just use this past weekend. So it was state basketball weekend. It's our version of March Madness in Kansas, and we're a heavy basketball-laden state. And I'm going to use not one of the smallest school districts. Mountain Ridge had both their boys and girls in the state finals. My guess is, I think an employee said this to me today, great time to rob a bank probably, because there would be no one left. It is the center. Schools are the center of attention in our smaller communities. And my guess is the majority of people not only had grandkids and kids, but they were going to go out and support their teams, and did. And so a lot of pride, and if you have to close those schools, that pride is hard to let go of, because I've lost my school, we're losing our community, and we're losing the history that made this town so great. So even as we see, and we're seeing this again from early 1900s in Kansas to today, we're migrating from rural Kansas to more urban areas, especially Johnson County right now, a little bit to a lesser extent Sedgwick County. But that's going on. And at the same time, we changed the Kansas Constitution to establish a new Board of Regents, a new State Board of Education, as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Tallman, a commissioner. So take us through that, and why was that done, and what is unique about the Constitution in Kansas versus most other states in this country?
Well, again, having been, 6 at the time, I can't tell you exactly what the motivation was, but everything that I've heard and studied and been passed down, from my elders, I think it really was part of this, call it new frontier spirit in America. We do have to improve. We have to get better. And so tough choices. We may lose some schools, but we need better schools. We may, lose some of that connection if we sort of empower a state board and give them more responsibility, but that's something that needs to be, and we shouldn't forget, somewhere in the early 60s, they passed the law that really moved us from junior colleges to community colleges, the idea that they have a broader role that you have to have a part of. So I think what drove all of that, controversial as it may have been, was the idea that the status quo that we were comfortable with for decades would not meet the demands of the future. And so that all happened maybe again kind of early to mid-60s before some of the social chaos really hit the way it did. But there was apparently, as you say, the ability to pass controversial legislation, maybe lose your legislative seat over it, but thought that it was important to do.
And I think if you, again, talk to people in that era, they would say, we thought it was the best thing to do for Kansas, even if it cost us a seat.
Right.
And as much as it hurt, because it may mean that we had to give up our school. And if you go to the state board, it was important that those were elected people given the general oversight of education, and they wanted that separate from the legislature because they wanted it to be by the people. We knew these people, kind of like our local boards, same a little bit different the Board of Regents, but we knew these people, and we could then vote them out of office if we didn't like it. And we did not want that to be a part of the legislative process.
And that goes back again to that tension, as you the phrase that some people think is kind of ironic. We talk about the state board having self-executing powers, which doesn't really sound good for them if they follow through with that and self-execute. But what it really means is they are seen to have some additional authority beyond the Board of Regents, not part of kind of the traditional three branches of government. And that, too, was seen as a deliberative saying, if we're going to ask these communities to give up some of that local, we still want to have a little bit of a separate, that check and balance, but it's also meant for the 30 plus years I've been doing this sort of constant, I don't want to say turf battle, may overstate it, but there's always a push and pull between what the state board thinks is their prerogative, what the legislature wants to do when they kind of clash. How do you get that resolved? Maybe sometimes that tension is helpful. At other times, I think kind of slow things down because you're unclear maybe exactly who has the responsibility, and yet you end up maybe fighting more over who can do it and maybe not spending as much time over what should be done where you'd hope we could find agreement on.
Yeah, and again, it's that clause that the state board will have, other than what's delegated to the Board of Regents, shall control all general interest of K-12 education, and that the legislature will make suitable provisions for finance. And we'll talk about that as we get into the court case. Also, and I don't know if you want to comment on that, Dean Mercer, but also at this time, late 60s, going in the early 70s, college enrollment's starting to go up quite a bit, and we're seeing many more people matriculate to Kansas State, KU, and our universities at that time.
Absolutely. There was a growth, and as Mark kind of touched on previously, that was a push and pull with society saying we want greater knowledge, maybe more maturity. We talked about that, but definitely we want knowledge and skills so that they're ready to step into our jobs. And it became a societal expectation. You go to college instead of what's best for you as an individual.
Right.
We swayed a little bit there.
Yeah, I think, and when we get to kind of finishing the end of kind of this look back history, we'll spend even maybe a greater amount of time from this point to the today. We're hoping that people listening I always say, you only want to know what we did in history, not necessarily to repeat, to know why it was done in this way. So then you can say, well, but times have changed, or no, I see now, and I don't want to change that. And I think whether we're talking about a national view, whether I think we're losing people that went through World War II, right? Mm-hmm. They're rapidly passing away at their advanced age. We're also losing people that went through the Holocaust. And so you hope that experience of World War II is played out, and we'll say the same thing about Vietnam in a few years, and Korea, and some of the civil rights, that people that lived it just understand what were the conditions by which they lived, and why did they do what they did. And then is it appropriate to undo that, or is it appropriate to modify it because times change? But certainly that was a pivotal moment in Kansas education, and the state board found itself in litigation right off the bat. 2 challenges to constitutional amendments to try to change the Constitution that were defeated. Teachers did not like licensure, and they got control, and there was lawsuits.
The local school board suing the state
That's right.
because they didn't want regulations.
And so it all played out with how the Supreme Court kind of then delegated that to it. Also, though, let's talk about, again, I'm jumping now back to the federal level, because we talked about equal access for all. We talked about then the expansion with Brown v. Board, that equal had to mean everyone. And then, as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Tallman, Dean Mercer, but by the 70s, we figured out students with disabilities were not allowed to go to Kansas schools. They were shuttled off somewhere else. And parents were saying, that's not right. My kid ought to have a right to this free public education you're talking about.
And all means all, right? And so it was a challenge. Figure it out. How do we make accommodations? How do we individualize for that child?
And I think another theme that runs all through this is, as education developed, it was very much seen as, well, a common school kind of means it's the same for everyone that's there, and we expect that. When you realize that there are a group of kids, and in particular kids with disabilities, that can't learn in the same way, just have conditions that affect that, then you have to think about doing something different. And I think that has also pushed this idea that schools have to walk this line between how do we individualize what kids need, but at the same time have some type of common standards, common expectations, so that we can kind of be reasonably assumed that everyone is getting that level that they need. I think another tension, so you talk about, parents decided that wasn't right, that some kids were really excluded. Well, that was certainly true of the parents of kids that were excluded. Wasn't necessarily as true of other parents too. And so that also then creates that, hate to say battle in some ways, but sometime, okay, finite resources, how much are we spending on special ed? Or put it another way, how much are we spending on language services? How much are we spending on at-risk? How much are we spending on those breakfast programs? So there also, even within that, there's needs that pushes these things to be added, but then you're kind of fighting against, again, maybe the status quo, or the folks for whom the system is working pretty well. They tend to be worried about what change might mean, okay? And I think that also becomes an issue, that why even today things that might seem like, well, all these federal programs are good, why might we get rid of them? Again, we don't know what will happen, but I think there's some that just say, well, boy, we're spending an awful lot of money on these things, and, should someone make us do that? And I think that goes back to the same era.
So let's take let's think about today. So, because we talk about the funding of this, so we have IDEA, the Individuals Disability Education Act, that says if I have a disability, and that's determined by a team, I have a right to have an individual education plan that helps with my disability. And if you fast forward to 2025, that hasn't been funded at the levels that it used to be funded at. So just what happens for the special ed kid or the regular ed kid when that funding for special ed, either at the federal level or the state level, isn't to the level that we want?
Well, then children pay the highest cost, right? So that child that needs special services, regardless of what that is, a piece of technology to be able to accommodate their learning style, a para in the classroom, whatever that need is, if that's not provided, that child misses out. But likewise, if what that child needs is a para in the classroom that helps them concentrate and focus, other kids in the classroom miss out because there's greater behavioral issues in that class for one teacher to be able to manage with an entire group. So it's a no-win situation all the way around if we're not funding the minimum. The school really,
special education parents, families have greater rights to try to assert the services they need, but we know many are still not satisfied. They still don't think they're getting enough. And yet at the school level, by providing whatever minimum they have to or think they have to have been directed to do, if funding isn't keeping up with that, it has to come from someone else. It has to come from other areas. And certainly in Kansas, and I think this is true of many states, we have seen a continued growth in the number of kids identified is needing special services across all kinds of ways, and we can debate what that is.
Autism
but it's
would be the greatest category
exactly.
of growth in the last
That's
20
right.
years.
Yeah, and so and a very expensive area, and so that too, we're not providing services to the same percent of the population as we were 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. It is a bigger number. It is a different set of different set of challenges. In many ways, a growth in the most kids with the highest need, because again, frankly, medical technology, more severely disabled students live and need to be served, but that creates tremendous costs. And kind of as you said with lunch, some of those are services that may not even seem strictly educational, but we've decided, as a society, the public school is there. It is the one place where you can provide that, at least during the school day from, age, really 3 or even earlier in some cases to 21. There'll be something there for that student and that family to be supported by.
Yeah, so again, I want our listeners to understand, so special, because of the federal law and state law that companions with it, school districts are required then to serve those special needs students to the level of that IEP. That money is not being denied. What has to happen if you're not fully funding special ed is a transfer of money from what would be the general education budget over to that, and that's where I think some of the discussion's happening. We're rapidly running out of time for this. I think we could go another couple hours, but I do want to.
We've only about reached where my career started, so I thought we were just getting going.
This is typical of when I used to teach U.S. history day by day, and we barely get to Vietnam and its ancient history again, right? But I want to jump to 2025, talk about some of the issues that are in front of us today, given kind of how we painted the picture of what's going on. Certainly, you've alluded to it. We see a movement from rural Kansas to suburban and urban parts of Kansas. So we now have a variety of school districts have less than 100 kids in them, and we didn't think we would see that in the 1960s. So we're getting smaller again. We've seen maybe post-COVID a drop in the number of students maybe seeking higher education, but we've seen more kids go on to technical. So just in a few minutes, where do you see education in 2025, given that our history? Where do you see the tension that we have now and the discussions that we have going forward? Dean Mercer, let's start with you.
So in a few minutes, you want an answer that we could take an entire semester to delve into.
We have to have part 3 and 4 and 5.
We very well may. So I'll put out two things and then let Mark add to it. One is social emotional learning, and we know that we have an increased number of students coming to school with traumatic backgrounds in some way, shape, or form. How does the school respond to that? What does that look like for children when we have them from 3 to 18, from 7:30 to 3:30? Their emotional needs are huge, and that's not where we've put an enormous amount of emphasis throughout the history that we've just discussed. I think the other issue that is critical and so close to my heart is a shortage of teachers. And we know that not every classroom has a teacher that has been prepared, that is qualified. And that's an issue that we have to continue to grapple with collectively.
Yeah, I think if you talk to any teacher today, they'll say post-COVID behavior is probably our number one thing we're dealing with, which then has an impact on academics. And if you talk to any principal or superintendent or school board, finding qualified, really great personnel, because as baby boomers, we are leaving all professions, and teaching just happens to be one of those.
Absolutely.
Mr. Tallman, any thoughts about today and kind of just the issues around today?
Well, I think what is striking, maybe goes back to your whole point, what's happening today is probably no different than as we look back. One thing that I'm struck by is that at virtually any point in history, we probably had two things going on. We were probably better educated as a society than we ever were before, and people were convinced education is in a crisis and schools were failing. And that both of those things could happen at the same time because we keep expecting more, and society demands more. And so again today, I've just been finishing some research, again, showing that our educational attainment levels, or Kansas and the nation, are really higher than they ever have been. And at the same time, there's a whole school of thought that says our schools are completely failing based on a different set of data. That always tends to be there. But I think the other thing that I think is particularly true now, and maybe something worth exploring in the future, I think it's something that comes back to the issue of trust. Public education, by being public education, means it is something provided by the public, ultimately accountable to their elected officials. We have a time right now when there are a lot of elected officials raising a lot of questions about what we're doing as an education system. And so I think what has to be worked through is how you maybe get those, I hate to say two sides, but I think sometimes it looks that way. How do you build trust between people kind of in the system, often who've given their lives to the system, are struggling with all the issues you've raised, and at the same time, the political process, electing people who have real concerns, and they don't understand what you're talking about with social emotional learning. They don't understand, and so finding a way, and maybe this podcast can be a step toward doing that as you go forward, finding a way to get people actually talking to each other about what we want to do, what we are doing, what it really is, what other things maybe we should do, what can be on the table, but having that trust between the public and its school system. If we're going to be successful going forward, I think we really have to work on that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, that's probably in any area we've debated how to do that, and we're debating it again. And some of it is the cost of education is going up, as anything else is. You go to medical, the cost has really gone up. When you want really good outcomes, we're debating whether the outcomes are any good. But if we look in general, more education is going on. More people are becoming more educated over the next several months, weeks, and on this podcast. And the reason we want you to tune in, we gave you kind of this history so that you can go back and you can listen over and over about what is Kansas, what was the United States, and then I have an understanding of where I want to be in this discussion. We're going to be having business leaders and teachers and all kinds of people on here where we can actually have debates in a productive way about what we want. Because I think at the end of the day, I haven't found very many people that do not want something best for our kids. How we get there, I think, is the debate in 2025, and probably always has been in the history of Kansas. Dr. Debbie Mercer, Dean of the College of Education at Kansas State University, Mr. Mark Tallman from KSB, thank you for being here with us on our first podcast. And now what I need all of you to do is you go to where you got your podcast, rate us, review us, tell everyone, tune in, subscribe to the podcast, share it with all your other people that get all of their news from podcasts, and say, hey, and if you didn't like the first one, we get better, right? We'll have you back. We get better. Every podcast goes back and say, well, we weren't as good in the first couple of episodes, but we're going to be here every month, and we may even get to this on a bi-monthly cycle, but certainly every month you can come and listen to KSDE Insight Podcast, where we'll get an opportunity to share with you the great things going on in public education and the challenges that are before us. So until then, I hope everyone has a good spring, and we'll be back with you next month.